It's so interesting.
It's so interesting.
It's so interesting.
It's interesting.
Welcome to It's So Interesting, where people talk about their work and life experience. I am George Spitzer. I have with me today Frank Goss of Sullivan and Goss, an American gallery in Santa Barbara, California. Frank is a very modest guy, but I'm going to force him to brag a little bit about the success of his gallery vis-a-vis all the other galleries in the United States. Please explain to me and everyone else the differentiation and your focus.
The focus of the gallery, it is called Sullivan, Goss, an American Gallery. We would be the only American gallery west of Santa Fe.
So you also, in addition to the restaurant, the gallery, education, and the university, you also publish books.
We do. We probably have done 20 books. It's not
and that supports the business.
It does. They're all about artists.
Being a publisher, I can't imagine you making money at it.
I'm just trying to control the losses on that side of the house. But as you know, it's the sort of secret that only publishers know and only publishers will ever reveal is that you might tell me something is good, but until it's in print, it's not true. And it's really true. People look at a book and go, "Oh, wow, it's in print. It says this guy's a good artist. He must be a good artist."
Well, you came up with an interesting product you mentioned to me about. You also develop artists, like the Dabo. The Dabo. Right. No one's ever heard of Leonard Dabo. Yeah. He just seemed to fall off the map, and there's this intact state in a dusty house somewhere. And, well, that's just the beginning. You got to educate the world that this is a collectible artist.
Right.
How do you do it?
Well, we did an awful lot of research to start, and it turns out that although Dabo, when he died at the age of 94, I think, or maybe 95, and he'd been ill the last few years of his life, and he didn't show much the last decade of his life. He kept all his paintings, and he didn't share them with a dealer, and as a consequence, when he died, nobody knew where the guy lived. He had won all kinds of awards. He had solo exhibition after solo. He had more solo exhibitions than pretty much any artist I know.
When was this?
Well, the solo exhibitions started in 1902, and his peak probably would have been in 14. And then he went off to fight the war, the First World War, and he came back and he started doing solo exhibits again, but he'd been gone for 6 years. So people were like, "Leon who?" Then he gets a better and better deal, and he's in the south of France at the tail end of 39. And as you know, in the fall of 39, the Germans take Poland. He's in the south of France with his wife, who's Jewish, and he realizes, oh, this might come our way. And he packs up a truck, drives the truck and his wife to Paris, and he arrives there on the 12th. The Germans arrive on the 14th. And so he never gets out. Well, there's Free France. Then he takes about 4 months to actually get out. But in the meantime, it happened again. It's like, wow, you fought World War I, and people forgot who you are. Now you're in occupied France. What happened to you, pal? And so two, I think, fairly big blunders, neither of which he could avoid. He was a true patriot. He thought the atrocities of World War I were so egregious that he signed up speaking 7 languages. He enlisted when he was 52. And they brought him in as a second Louis and eventually left as a captain. And he was there the day, he was in the building when the armistice was signed. And so he's there. He's essential to lots of things going on. He's a big part of the 4th Regiment, but he gave up his art career. And nobody, 6 years later, is Leon who? And so ultimately he got forgotten. When he died, he left things to his wife, who was elderly at the time. When she died 14 years later, she left things to her sister, who was more elderly at the time. When she died, she left things to their brother, who was gay, and he had a different last name, who then left things to his mate in life, who had a different last name, who then found another mate when the younger mate died, and he left things to that guy. It was another different life. It's impossible to find this. You couldn't have found the Dabo estate with the best kind of detective work. They just called out of the blue one day and said, "We have the estate of Leon Dabo." And I thought, there is no estate of Leon Dabo. What kind of who is this? And then we questioned them, and it sounded like maybe. And then Nathan and I got in a plane and flew to New York, and we went and saw it, and by God, the estate was there. So the first thing we did was research him enough to know that, as unknown as he is, he's in a few museums that you know. He's in the Louvre, most important museum on the planet. He's in the Musée d'Orsay, the great Impressionist museum. He's in the Met. You've heard of that. The Metropolitan Museum of New York. He's in the Frick. He's in the Smithsonian. He's in the Boston Club. I mean, he's in every, I think, 50 major museums in the United States, the most important museums in the United States. Not a single museum, by the way, on the West Coast. He was really an East Coaster. And so that's where we're finding the bulk of the market for him.
You mentioned market, because once mentioned to me a while ago how you have to have people who want to collect paintings. You do some packaging for museums. Could you describe that for me?
We're always working with museums who are going to show artists that we have. And so they will ask us to pack things carefully and send them insured. And that there's a little bit of finesse to that. We have a couple guys here who are really good at doing that kind of work. We are always sort of a little laggard in that area, but we're always working with museums to make sure that our artists whose work is here, is shown when there's a show coming up. And most of the museums know us, and so they'll contact us to make sure that because they're looking for paintings, right? And we don't charge them for the paintings; they just borrow them and put them on the wall, and that's certainly good for us. So I would say we are always working with 6 or 7 museums constantly.
How important is it for you as a businessman and a gallery owner to own as many paintings of a particular artist as possible? Does it matter?
It ultimately is. The difference between consigned and owned is really big in terms of financial commitment. There's no financial commitment to a consigned painting. And there's also not as big a reward. If a consigned painter comes in and says, I know this is worth $100,000, but I'd like you to sell it for me, or I'll bring it to auction. And the auctions are going to charge about 25% for a $100,000 painting. And so we look at them and we say, well, yes, it's worth $100,000. We'll net you 75, and we'll take that into inventory. We might, let's say we bought 20 years ago, we bought a Lockwood de Forest for $500. We can sell it for today for $20,000 if we were smart enough to buy the Lockwood de Forest 20 years ago at $500. So there's a much greater upside to owning than there is to consigning, but I would rather have those good paintings come here than go to an auction house. So we're happy to consign things.
And auction houses are your competition, or
they're big competition, huge competition today. Yeah, and they're partially the economy is responsible for the loss of all those art galleries across the United States, but the other reason is that auction houses have become much more aggressive. It used to be they only wanted things that sold like at $1 million or $2 million or $10 million. Today they're perfectly, Christie's and Sotheby's are perfectly happy to take things that are $20,000. Well, that's the sort of sweet spot in our inventory. So all of a sudden we're faced with, okay, I can buy this from the auction house for $20,000, or I can buy it today from you, but you got to do better than 20. So we make an accommodation if we can and move on.
You win some, you lose some.
Yeah, but we can't, like if somebody comes in and the piece that they're looking at is consigned, and they say, well, we want 25% off, we have to say, sorry, I don't own it, and I owe 25% when I sell it, and I agreed not to sell it for less than $75,000, so you have to do better than that. Usually there's a way to find a middle, but it's very interesting. There's so little money in consigned pieces that we have to be very careful.
So you really do favor owning the painting if it's the right price.
Yeah. And it's easier with that many pieces of art, keeping track of, there are probably 300 or 400 pieces here that belong to somebody else. You have to keep track of those. You have to insure those. You have to inventory them.
Yeah.
We don't own them. They're the most sort of special things here in some ways.
Conversely, it's a very almost dumb question. Maybe it is. You'll have to tell me. How many paintings do you own? And where are they located?
We own about 2,000 paintings.
Yeah.
They're here and they're on site. There are warehouses on site. Mm-hmm. Our attic cavities, you could walk up there.
Yeah.
And there's thousands of paintings up there. We maybe own 2,500 works on paper. Mm-hmm. And so a work on paper, you know what a stack of 500 sheets of paper look like. It's not very big. Yeah. So we can keep those as long as they're not framed in a relatively small space. But paintings are almost always framed. And so for us to hold 2,000 plus the 500 that are consigned, 2,500 paintings means that our inventory system has to be flawless. And there are every once in a while accidents that happen. Develop a leak in a roof and it leaks into a room where there's paintings. Like, oh my God, then the whistle blows and we're all of a sudden all hands are on deck and trying to figure out what's going on. We rent the building that you and I are in right now. And the landlord thought it was okay to use our hallway to do some pre-construction. He asked me, can I use that hallway? And I said, sure, but we need to be there. He didn't need to hear the we need to be there part. And so all of a sudden there was a crew of 5 or 6 contractors in a space where we're secured, and we then had to do an inventory that probably cost us $4,000 to make sure that nothing had been stolen, because we didn't know what had happened when we weren't there. And ultimately they hadn't taken anything, and everything was secure and everything was where it should have been. But the thought of having people who are not trained in art and may or may not be honest, we just didn't know. And so that was all hands on deck.
Thank you for taking your time to be with us, Frank.
You're welcome.
If you want to contact Frank, you go to the website for It's So Interesting, and there's the information.
Good. Well, thank you, George. It's a pleasure.
So interesting.
It's so interesting.
So
It's so
interesting.
interesting.
It's interesting.